So thank you very much for having me. I live and work on the traditional lands on the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation, or as some of you know, Winnipeg. And some of the work that I will be presenting today is on the topic of chemsex and party and play. So without much ado, let's start this work. So some of the work that I do, and just to provide you some context, I work in a lab, the Village Lab, where we do community-based health research, HIV/AIDS community-based research, harm reduction research. And our lab is staffed with myself, director, Indigenous elders, and knowledge keepers, peers, graduate and undergraduate students and trainees, and research assistants. And so all the work that we do is really contextualized within this lab. So to start our discussion today, I would like just to take a few moments to kind of open our minds a little bit about this topic of chemsex, this topic of party and play. Just a quick kind of definition, conceptualization of PMP chemsex that I will be using today in this presentation. So the way I understand it as a kind of a social practice among different communities, often among gay, bi, queer men, which refers to sex that occurs under the influence of different substances. We hear the term chemsex, we hear the term PMP, party and play. I hear a lot in Australia the term, and UK, wired play, sexualized drug use, all kind of referring to the same practice, the same idea. In terms of some of the substances that are involved that we know from perspectives of community, but also research, it includes things like crystal meth, could also include GHB, ketamine, cocaine, MDMA, methadone, and actually a multiplicity of other substances in combination, in concurs as well. When we try to see how different people, researchers, community, try to define what is chemsex, what is party and play, we can actually see different streams of thought and different ways that people conceptualize it. Sometimes we review literature, we'll read books, and we see how people kind of define chemsex as something really bad. It's an addiction, it's an issue, it's something that needs to be addressed, right? So this group of people who adhere to this line of thought really conceptualize party and play as some kind of psychosocial issue that needs to be resolved. Quite a stigmatizing, pathologizing perspective, but it is happening. That's what people are doing, that's how people are creating knowledge. Another perspective, other group of scholars, the way they conceptualize it is as a subculture. As a subculture where people have their own ways of communication, interaction, group norms, social norms, values within chemsex and party and play. So that's a second definition referring to subculture or cultural practice. There's also some individuals who conceptualize PMP and chemsex as an institutional response. So what they say is, hey, look at queer, gay, bi, two-spirit men, look how they're marginalized in the community. Look at all this marginalization. So what's happening here is different institutions, public health, police, other institutions are pushing community away. And so institutions are pushing PMP community or those scenes in which PMP finds itself underground. So that's an example of a more institutional response and how we define PMP and chemsex. There's also a group of scholars who say, let's think about PMP and chemsex from a more fun perspective. This group of individuals operationalize PMP and chemsex as a form of play. And so we see this a lot in cultural studies, we see this a lot in sociology, and other disciplines. So here, PMP could be understood as a process during which, for example, people navigate different types of play, PMP here is characterized as equivalent of cruising. It's casual, it's fun, it's obligation-free. So this is a form of PMP as a play. And then there's a group of scholars, lots of them kind of coming from post-structural theories, and they really think of PMP as a form of desire. A PMP is a form of desire where we see human behavior as an outcome of desire to form connections. So for example, substances may serve as tools to achieve particular desired actions. For example, to overcome internal restrictions, maybe I want to disinhibit my feelings or guilt or knowledge about substances or STIs. Maybe I want to disinhibit my physical limitations. So in this form, it could also be understood as a form of desire. So what I want to do with you today for a few minutes is to just anchor us a little bit in some of the research that we've conducted on PMP and chemsex in Toronto a few years ago. And so when we started working on this project, trying to understand what party and play in chemsex is, we've noticed pretty fast that there's a lot of work that's very stigmatizing, a lot of research that's very pathologizing. PMP and chemsex is bad, bad, bad. It's all about HIV and STIs. It's all about addiction. And very quickly we realized for some people it might be an issue, but we are missing something here. We're missing an opportunity to really understand what PMP and chemsex is, to go deeper into this understanding. And so we came up with this research that we conducted in Toronto. Can I get some help? It's moving here, but not there for some reason. So while we're trying to fix this, I'll just provide you a little bit more context on. So, like I said, a lot of work on stigma and pathology, not very welcoming to community. So we try to say, well, thank you, great. It's all good. So we said, okay, let's look a little bit at some other areas of chemsex and party and play. Can we study anything about pleasure? Can we study something about resilience within chemsex and PMP? And so what we did for this project is we finished recruitment in actually 2017, so quite a few years, 5 years ago. We recruited the community through the means of this landing page, pnpstudy.com, using a variety of social media, aid service organizations, community-based organizations, flyers in the community, and word of mouth. And we did 1-hour interviews and a quick, brief demographic questionnaire, and we subjected the data to discourse analysis. This is a beautiful poster that we have created. One member of the Latino community offered an opportunity to take his picture, and the eligibility criteria referred to being a self-identity of gay, bi, queer, two-spirit, having sex with guys, using substances in the last year, and being 18 years of age. In terms of who, before I start presenting some of the narratives from this research, I just want to give you a little bit of an idea who actually got captured in terms of whose voices got captured. So this was a small qualitative research, 44 individuals. Average age was about 37. Majority of participants actually self-identified as gay. Majority had some college, some university education, and 40% of the sample were individuals from a variety of ethno-racialized communities. So the first quote that I want to present to you, it's a very salient quote. It speaks about, so what's so special about chemsex? What's so special about party and play? So under each quote, you will see a quick sort of demographic identifier. So what's so special about chemsex? Sex is just better on it. Orgasm is about 100 times better. You get fucked for a long period of time. You enjoy sex. You don't get bored. You're always horny. It's good. That's basically it. I use it as an aphrodisiac. It can get me hard, and it can go like 10 times, 12 times in a night, constantly. Sober sex is boring. Now that I've tried crystal, it's boring without it. It doesn't make me orgasm as much. Another perspective is from an individual who speaks about what does PMP, what does chemsex actually do for them? People do PMP because you want to feel or you want to forget about all your inhibitions. I do it because I want to forget about all of my inhibitions. As a religious person, sex was always a very difficult thing for me. And I started it because I wanted to forget about all of it. If I wanted to be fisted, if I wanted to lick somebody's ass, if I wanted to suck 2 or 3 cocks, if I wanted to have 2 cocks in me, that will allow me to do it. And so people do it because of that, because it opens your inhibitions more and more. This third perspective is from an individual who just shares a little bit more about what was chemsex for them, what was PMP for them. So what was your experience like? I tend to get into more kinkier, taboo, and I'm usually more aggressive, at top. So occasionally I get the urge to bottom, and things like GHB will allow you to do a lot more things. If you're tempted to take that fist, poppers and marijuana are not going to cut it. I was playing with a few guys. I've done a mixture of drugs, GKT, whatever. We were quite from the pig side of the spectrum. There was mutual fisting going on and stuff like that. I tried saline infusions in my scrotum and had 2 liters of saline in my scrotum in the end. I sat there with an IV and the whole thing. I actually did enjoy it. There was no way you were going to get an IV into my scrotum sober. And so those were some of the experiences from participants, and we got quite a lot of them, very salient, very kind of important narratives. We also got a lot with regards to the context of advancements in HIV prevention, in HIV treatment, and its intersection with party and play and chemsex. For example, our findings with regards to PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, show how participants' decision to not use condoms was contingent on multiple elements. For example, I'm on PrEP, so it depends on how well I know the person or not, is my factor for that. If it's a person that I know and I know their status, I know they're on PrEP, I know a little bit more about their sexual history, then, I'm more willing to not use a condom. But usually, if it's someone that I don't know, we'll use a condom, but I wouldn't say it's 100%. A lot of discussion also on undetectability and treatment as prevention, U equals U. So when the conversation happened and we're all high and he told me that he's paused and he also told me that he's undetectable, I let him fuck me because I had knowledge of undetectable prior to this, but I find a lot of younger guys don't understand what it means to be undetectable. So a lot of interaction between kind of the world of HIV, undetectability, PrEP, and chemsex. Now we're getting into some of the narratives on PMP and pleasure. One thing right away, we realized that for many individuals in our project, ideas about sexual and drug-related risk, for example, were connected to their sexual scripts on pleasure. When I was going to have sex with a guy that I was going to meet at the bathhouse, who was going to fuck me bareback, having another guy's semen in me, it was a real turn-on. For some participants, pleasure was also connected to their exploration of sexual boundaries and limits. And this is the type of narratives that we got a lot in our research. Sex is phenomenal, and I try things that I normally wouldn't. This is not a new thing. A lot of researchers have already pointed this out, chemsex and party and play, as this form of boundary play. You kind of play with your boundaries, playing with your limits as a human being. So this is kind of the narratives on pleasure and PMP, but there's more of them. Just think about the best sex you've ever had and multiply it by 10. It's absolutely amazing. It's that rush of dopamine. And for me, the minute I slam, it goes right to my dick, and all I want to do is just fuck. It's that instant, that rush. It doesn't matter who is there, I'm going to fuck. GHB is the thing that really amps up my horniness. For me, tea or crystal, it gets me horny. It also gives me energy. All of a sudden, there are no limits. Rough sex becomes pleasurable rather than painful. So these were kind of the narratives on pleasure and party and play. But with regards to the narratives of resilience, what we got here is a lot of information from community about how PMP and stigma in the community could be resisted. So a lot of gay bi men who PMP'd resisted social exclusion, resisted stigma by describing how they capitalize on resilience in their communities, how they build friendships, social bonds, the relations of care in the PMP networks. For example, I make sure everybody has their own fit, their own needle. I make sure that somebody's over in that corner with their rigs, somebody's over in the bedroom with their rigs, but everybody's in a separate place. The idea being, I don't want anybody having the possibility of getting Hep C or HIV or transferring it or stuff like that. So I do take care of my partners in that sense. My friends are my community. Everybody knows that, so it adds to the comfort level. Another individual spoke about this in a different way. People would check up on you if they haven't seen you or heard you from a bit, they would check up on you. It's a community that does take care of its own. So what we saw from that research, pleasure was a very important element in rationalization for riskier practice among some individuals. Men who are part of the PMP enact relations of care within various PMP activities. Experienced men who PMP act as caring peers who perform a variety of functions, not just friendships and support, but also initiation into substance use, routes of administration, scoring, and teaching others about safer sex or drug use, and troubleshooting in a crisis. So we had quite a lot of important data that facilitated very targeted development of sexual health promotion. And what we recommended from our research is to start thinking about how we can tap into those relations and practices of care, resilience of this population, with the hope that maybe there's a possibility of thinking of more empowerment-based peer harm reduction strategies that could actually emerge from this. And what we recommended to communities to think more how pleasure, how resilience, and relations of care may actually be intertwined with people's risks for whatever, HIV, Hep C, STD-BI risks within a more constructed experience of party and play. What I want to do in the remaining few minutes now that I've presented you a little bit about research, which was conducted a little bit more than 5 years ago, what happened after that? So what happened after that is a lot more knowledge, a lot more research on PMP and chemsex from very different perspectives. So I want to present to you in a few minutes a very brief assessment of the current state of knowledge on chemsex, on party and play, that's been published over the past 5 years, somewhere between 2017 all the way to July 2022. So what we see right now, sorry, it's a very small print, but I can actually tell you about this. So what we see right now is a lot of research on understanding what is consent in the context of PMP. People are trying to operationalize consent, think about it more, what it means. So we see a lot of research, how consent needs to be further conceptualized in the context of drug use and sex parties. We continually see a lot of research on chemsex and HIV, still a lot of research. I would say a majority of studies that are published still in this area of work. So here we see a lot about PrEP, for example. We see a lot of research which are some of the most common substances, how they connect to HIV. And we also see a lot of research that shows that people who are living with HIV are more likely to engage into party and play. But once again, this is not a new thing, because we knew for a long time that for many individuals who are living with HIV, PMP and chemsex works for them as a space of refuge, where they can live without the social exclusion and stigma that they face in the community. A lot of research is now starting to look at how medical advances in HIV treatment and prevention influence chemsex, so PrEP, U equals U. There's still quite a lot of research on that. A lot of studies that attempt to establish prevalence. So for example, a study in Portugal says prevalence of chemsex was about 20% in their sample of 1,300 individuals that they interviewed. Another study in Paris looked at university students, established chemsex prevalence at about 20%. So kind of we're playing with those interesting numbers. There's a lot of research that says we need to understand prevalence before we go and move to the policy recommendations. So a lot of interesting narratives in that kind of realm. A significant number of studies that look at the connection between mental health and chemsex are emerging in the field. So we see a lot about co-occurring mental health experiences such as depression, such as anxiety. We see, for example, research from Norway, which says that 14% self-reported chemsex, and 1/5 of men in their sample had some form of reduced mental health. And they say that when you offer interventions related to chemsex, make sure that those interventions take into account very seriously mental health and mental health context. Some studies now focus a lot on interventions, on supports and programs for chemsex. This is kind of my favorite line of research, very pragmatic, comes a lot from frontline providers, from community members, from peers. A lot of new, interesting approaches in chemsex, a lot of interventions. There's also quite a lot of work on researchers and scholars who try to still understand what is chemsex, what is PMP. A lot of interesting research that speaks about how chemsex is a practice of subcultural reproduction that connects gay and bisexual men across generations, ensuring the survival of our culture. So some people are saying chemsex and PMP is how queer men are able to pass their culture on through generations, because there might not be other platforms for our community to do so. So people are still trying to understand the meanings. A lot of interesting work from our colleague David Stewart, who passed away, about the meaning of the word chemsex, what it means. So a lot of work on that. Increasing number of studies that focus on different methodological approaches, different theories, try to think about chemsex in different ways. Very little research from the perspectives of frontline providers and peers. Very unfortunate. That's an important consideration for us to think how we can support frontline providers, how we can support community and peers in making sure that this knowledge also gets represented, not just the more privileged perspectives of academics and researchers who live in an ivory tower and kind of create this knowledge. So unfortunately, very little on that. Still a lot of research on chemsex and PMP risks. Yes, it's unfortunate, it's stigmatizing, it's pathologizing, but this is also coming a lot from public health, from psychology, from medicine, kind of those disciplines which are still looking at the idea of risk. Some research, mostly coming from Western Europe, European context, that's still, that looks at the idea of pleasure, how we can grasp pleasure in the context of PMP, some research on exclusion and stigma. One thing that we see from existing research is it's really not taking into account any resilience, any maybe positive factors of chemsex that work for community. So that's still very minimal. Very little research still on PMP, communication, information and communication technologies, how people hook up using technologies. So more research could be useful to better understand the context. Much less research that compares communities. So we see a lot, for example, on gay, bi, queer men, on this community, but less about comparative lens, right? Still a lot of research on theoretical, conceptual areas of chemsex. Not much on national or regional differences in chemsex cultures, and almost no research on women, trans, and non-binary people who are underrepresented in current literature. So that's all from me. I really appreciate all your attention, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rusty, for your very interesting presentation. You have 10 minutes of questions. So the microphone is with Justine there. So please, we need to use the microphone for the question. Oh, okay. We need to use the microphone for question because of the recording. So please, Justine will bring you the microphone. So yeah, please feel free to ask a question. Yeah, there's one there.
Bonjour, hello. I have a question regarding your research. You briefly mentioned in the last 30 seconds the heterosexual community. If we're going to marginalize gay men and bisexual men, we have to remember that heterosexuals also are marginalized by PMP, and then that wasn't invented by gay men or bisexual men.
Yeah. No,
so I was wondering what are the connections between the two communities?
The connection between two communities, so you're correct. There is a lot of research that looks specifically at gay bi men and the social practice. There's some research that looks at straight men who are having sex with other men in the context of sex work, for example, or other context. There is not much work done on heterosexual communities, and I bet part of the reason because of the cultural context, in which PMP and chemsex has originated. Yeah, I think it's an omission. I think it's a gap. I think more work could be actually very interesting to look at how different things operate culturally for different communities. So it could definitely add something that to this line of work. Did I answer your question? Good.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Do we have data or papers that investigate the more subcultural aspect of chemsex? I mean, for me, chemsex is not just about sexualized use of drugs. It's also norms, culture, atmospheres, bodies, pictures, musics. And I would like to know if there are papers about that.
So, not to show off, but some of our research in Toronto actually looked at subcultural aspect. So we looked at how people who engage in chemsex, how they think about their culture, how they communicate using online technologies, how there's different languages embedded within the chemsex subculture, whether it's on apps, on hookup apps, or just in communication-wise. We looked a lot at the social norms that regulate, for example, the use of PrEP or condom use in the context of chemsex. There's a lot of work that looks at the subcultural aspects of chemsex. I would say majority of studies from the sociological fields actually utilize subcultural theories in different ways to understand chemsex. It's definitely proliferation of research on that.
Thanks. Hi, Rusty.
Hello.
Thanks for your presentation. You mentioned that there's not a lot of research that comes from the perspective of providers or peers.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, can you elaborate on what you think some of the barriers to that are and what can be done to overcome those barriers?
Absolutely. I think one of the barriers is a lot of community-based organizations, a lot of aid service organizations are not funded enough to really do this kind of evaluation and research. A lot of, in a more privileged context, researchers get all this money and fundings and doing all these big studies, not necessarily including the voices of frontline perspectives, peers. Sometimes they are, sometimes they don't do that good of a deal. So I think that's part of the reason is we need to make sure that not just the frontline voices and peers and those voices are represented, but that they're also properly funded to do this kind of work. A lot of very interesting work, a lot of very important research is coming from the perspectives of frontline providers and peers who are actually the experts on this field, right? So it's unfortunate that there's so little. So it's about funding, but it's also about the researchers, the scholars who need to do a better job of centering these voices of inclusion.
Thanks very much for your overview of the research at the end. I thought it was very helpful. There were a few things I just wanted to add. There is really interesting work about trans and sex workers coming from Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Unfortunately, they're not very available now, but they have done good work on that. Also, something that came up early on in chemsex response was this whole idea of we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't, and a real definition of people talking about the kind of stresses that they're experiencing inside the communities. And John Pachankas has been doing interesting work about intra-community stress, which I think is really important when we start talking about prevention, because it's really not talked about when we talk about prevention, the kind of pressures that people are feeling in the communities and that draw them to escape issues or trying to work in community.
That's right.
And the last thing is that, well, two things. HIV and neurodiversity. I think that there's more work going on about neurodiversity as sort of a precursor to availability for infections and difficult social outcomes. And finally, we've been doing some work with women on women and amphetamine use, and that's really helping, back to the person talking about heterosexuality, is helping sort chemsex doesn't equal sexualized drug use, nor does amphetamine use get reduced to sexual use. There are a lot of heterosexuals who've been doing various kinds of speeds for years, not necessarily hooking them up to sex. And now there are, we're hearing in Europe at least, growing numbers of women who are doing more amphetamine use, often not as chemsex, sometimes as sex work, sometimes just to do physical labor. So
that's right.
Homework.
Yep. No, thank you.
So I was wondering if there was any work that's been, so you identified an important gap with trans and non-binary communities, and if there was any work regarding the experiences of racialized or ethno-racialized communities. We see within gay, bisexual, and queer communities how sexual racism is an important problem, and I was wondering if there's any data or any work done in chemsex contexts, if their experience relate or differs.
Yeah. Not so much in a cultural chemsex context, but there is research that's looking at ethno-racialized communities in the context of drug use and substance use in general. So not necessarily like the cultural research studies of chemsex and PMP. But what's interesting, a lot of that research that you mentioned, for example, sexualized racism, a lot of this research is still grasping this area from a very pathologizing and stigmatizing perspectives, right? What's interesting about the cultural research on PMP, it's trying to see a more holistic picture, right? Positives and negatives, and also the whole culture that comes with it. So I think there's still a lot more work needs to be done to make sure that these communities, ethno-racialized communities, racialized communities, are included in the cultural research on PMP.
Hi, is there any data on comorbidities from the PNP community?
Yes, comorbidities in relation to mental health, a lot of research on the relationship between chemsex and depression, for example, chemsex and anxiety, but also co-occurring, for example, other conditions. And there's also a lot of research, comorbidities, for example, between HIV and Hep C, and also the context of partying. There's a lot of that, that's for sure.